It's 5 a.m. I've been meditating on whether or not drugs have anything to do with enlightenment. As there are some recent books to this effect, and there's some ancient traditions. So shamanism is the original religion, and they evidently used mushrooms. Then there's soma, described in the first original sermon of Hinduism. I have drunk soma. I will put the earth here or there. Something like that. In other words, I am huge, vast, realization of vastness. So, here are my notes on the case. From what I've been reading, I've read, not all, but I spent like 30 years reading. I've read all the LSD books, or a lot. I read Tim Leary and the history of Albert Hoffman. Someone wrote a really great book about LSD in the 60s, covering the CIA and everything. And and then there's the recent book about DMT, the spirit molecule. And my conclusion is, as far as I know, there are very few cases of real enlightenment described in these books about LSD and DMT, especially the DMT, the spirit molecule. I remember reading that whole book. This is after my own Zen experience, and thinking, there's nothing here of any spiritual value, a teaching or an experience. But yet, there is one book that stands out from the 60s. It's called The Lazy Man's Guide to Enlightenment. And that was written by Thaddeus Golas. It's a very short book, and it evidently comes out of his LSD experience. But for that one book, there are many other people who, have had breakdowns of one kind or another permanently. I mean, the mind is a fragile thing, and we smash it around at our peril. But yet it is worthwhile, I think. I mean, the idea that 85 micrograms of anything can permanently change how you look at the world is a valuable idea, and certainly worthwhile knowing that everything you think you know could be wrong just on ingesting 85 micrograms of something. That's quite a revelation. But then there's the story of Tim Leary, Ram Dass, Bhagavan Das, and Charles Manson. So these are all LSD takers. Tim Leary, Ram Dass, Charles Manson took a lot of LSD, evidently. So if we take LSD, are we going to say, I'm going to be one of these guys? Could I possibly end up being Charles Manson? I mean, we would, something to worry about. But Leary is interesting, stated pretty much a materialist, even though he wrote about the Tibetan Book of the Dead and so on. From what I can gather, he ended his life as a materialist, having his head preserved and liquid nitrogen was the most ridiculous thing you could think of, thinking the computers are going to recreate his consciousness. But Ram Dass became a spiritualist. So I would say Ram Dass is the one success story out of the LSD stories. And Bhagavan Das is an interesting story. As a compliment to Ram Dass, he was the one who kept telling Ram Dass to be here now. And he wrote his own book. But there's a great interview with him online about his Vipassana retreat, which he did late in life, I think not too long ago. And he describes in this article or interview how a single 10-day Vipassana retreat showed him more than his decades of bhakti yoga and drug use. So he is telling us something very valuable, that he spent decades taking drugs, blah, 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 doing bhakti yoga, being worshipped as a guru. Then after all that, he does a 10-day Vipassana retreat, and he says it was one of the most important experiences of his life, with no drugs, let's say. Just the rituals and the 10 days of staying with it, rather than, the normal course of doing something different every day. Then so the other cautionary thing about drugs is, I think Suzuki Roshi had a great quote. Our way is just to ride on the train. If we look too closely at the rails, we get dizzy. So he's doing practice like this Vipassana retreat. We're just riding on the train. But we're not too worried about looking too closely at the rails, which maybe like taking drugs or something. We get dizzy, which means we could have a very traumatic, disorienting experience that we may not recover from. The other books of interest are, DMT, Spirit Molecule. That's interesting reading, but not enlightening. Then there were the Pikal and Tikal books by Sasha Shulgin, who died a few years ago. And those are I read both of those, I think. They're very long and just like the recipes. And he was an amazing chemist and took all these varieties. I mean, I don't think anyone who historically can ever come close to what he did. But from what I remember reading, it's been a long while, but I didn't see anything of spiritual value in that. This life work that he did of cooking all these chemicals and taking them all. I mean, just doing a simple Vipassana retreat with just tea and cookies would be more valuable than all these chemicals he took described in these two books. Maybe, I don't know, could be wrong. But this is the new book that I have not read it. I watched him in a few interviews, and he's got the great presentation, and he's going to start a new movement. But I looked in the index, and there's nothing about Kundalini or Enlightenment, and he must talk about meditation, I'm sure, but I didn't. He's just talking about his trips and the default mode network is science thinks they understand something now, neuroscience. So we have a new kind of brain scanner. The fucking scientists are always think they have explained something by looking at brain scans. Oh, it never ends, Christopher John said, scientific proof for the existence of God will soon be announced by the White House. The crack up, I don't know. Anyway, DMT. So there's supposedly DMT in the brain, and which maybe explains the Kundalini experience. And Kundalini can happen with no drugs, and it can happen after a near-death experience, which helps to completely stop thought, through trauma. And then Kundalini arises, and then synchronicities follow, all with endogenous DMT possibly, or whatever it is that's coursing through the chakras. So that's my take on drugs and enlightenment, that a 10-day Vipassana retreat would be worth decades of drug use. And although one drug experience may be worth convincing one that the ordinary reality is somewhat of a veil. It's very tenuous. I mean, we should respect ordinary sanity. It's there for a reason. But it can be easily shifted with trauma, like a near-death experience. And then accessing the universal consciousness behind all phenomena can result in religion. And then the followers of such a person can institutionalize their misunderstandings, and then becomes dogma and oppression. So let's hope we avoid all that.